Good evening and welcome to the Freedom News Review. I'm Freedom Editor Uri Gorin. With us is Simon from Freedom Press. Apologies for the truncated panel tonight and its lack of diversity. Hopefully, from next week on, we will have more people and more different kinds of people. Tonight, we've got three main topics that we'd like to cover for you. One, starting with local news. We're going to look at um, both the brewing farmers' protests in the UK and what those mean for protest rights, alongside uh, different streams of resistance surrounding arms sales to Israel. We're going to look at, again, the prospects for US international politics following the election of Donald Trump. And finally, a bit of good news, we hope. We'll look at the conclusion of the AntiCOP, the sort of counter summit to the Conference of Parties of the UN climate agreement held by indigenous peoples from around Latin America and the world in Mexico, which concluded with grassroots proposals for managing the climate disaster. Let us start then with UK news. Sam, would you like to introduce kind of what is turning out to be a rather contradictory landscape for the government, at least, when it comes to policing protests?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that this is the first. Both of the most recent eruptions of protest have been on the right rather than on the left. Just about. I mean, the obviously the first one being the far right riots, and this one being farmers, not generally known as Labour voters. I think it's fair to say, but it's a more interesting phenomenon than it would appear at first blush. I think, in as much as um, most of the farmers who are involved in these protests are not kind of the multi-million dollar, super wealthy types in their everyday lives that you might kind of imagine from kind of, the classic films and all this kind of stuff. They tend to be asset rich and income poor. Um, and they tend to be squeezed quite heavily, both by the much more dominant agribusiness sector and also their customers, the sort of the big retailers.
We should
Which,
mention just at this point that this is a protest that has been focusing on the government's intention to impose an inheritance tax over farms worth more than £1 million. And 1 million may sound like a lot of money, but when you think about the price of land in this country, okay, a farm that has this nominal value worth of £1 million is not a massive operation, actually. Okay, it's kind of touching what is quite a lower tier in terms of small businesses and so on. It's sort of what we it's not exactly people who are living paycheck to paycheck, but it's also not the rich agribusiness interest. It would look very
yeah,
different if that tax were to be imposed from, let's say, a farm value of 10 million and up.
yeah, absolutely. It's very much it's not uncommon when you have people being interviewed on the topic for them to say, my farm is worth 1 million plus, but my income, my actual profit year on year is more like 14 to 20,000 or something like that. And where they are not wrong is in saying that if you have a system which inheritance tax forces them to sell their farm, this this doesn't suddenly mean that everything becomes more egalitarian. What actually happens is that the farm is sold and probably bought by a giant agribusiness of another kind, or it goes to some other form. It gets sold for housing or whatever. And generally speaking, it is a skilled business, skilled job, skilled business. And where I think they are kind of pushing it a little bit is in saying, if we're not there to do the farming, then who will do it? And it's like, well, the reason that you're in that position is because farmers have, for generations, sewn up who's allowed to be a farmer, essentially. These are multi-generational hanging on to their land types. They're not kind of doing it out of the goodness of their heart. And anyone who's lived in the countryside is well aware of exactly how farmers act. They're not, they're small business owners. They're not like charitable, socially minded people a lot of the time.
I think there's
Um,
a big difference between an inheritance tax and the abolition of inheritance, or the fact that those who work the land are the ones who manage it and who have the control over what they do with it, right? So, I think that as anarchists, we do want, or, we want more equality. But this shows us a way in which governments are kind of bound to botch that up, and B, the way in which trying to do that, again, as an end of pipeline taxation solution, so to speak, basically gives a lot of stock feed to the right wing, that can, wed that to, let's say, ownership oriented interests, rather than looking at broader things like, how we farm, and what markets do we farm for, and whether we farm for markets or whether we farm to supply people's needs. But there's another interesting point, I think, about this, and this was a point that someone made on social media. There was one of these farming kind of action networks declaring that they had this kind of plans to block supply chains and so on. And this person commented, yeah, well, I'd like to see them getting, surely the state is not going to now arrest them for conspiracy to, whatever it is that they apply to environmental protesters or to Palestine protesters. And I think that, whatever our thinking about the farmers' motivations, or, the sector they belong to, their class orientation, or whatever else, in my opinion at least, it's a good thing that they are challenging the government's keenness to use draconian protest laws in order to preempt action in the streets. So, yes, they're doing it because they are up against a more powerful sector than environmentalists or Palestine protesters. I mean, if they were, if we had a urban worker movements who were up for these kind of protest actions, then the government would also probably think twice before applying these kind of draconian measures to them. The question is whether that will also help maybe push the balance or push back against the erosion of protest rights for everybody, or whether this kind of two-tiered policing that we've been also talking about is going to stay prevalent, and nobody will care about the hypocrisy. Who knows?
like I certainly think that the obviously the right has a far more, or tends to have far more leeway than the left when it comes to what they can get away with in protests, because they are the loyal revolt rather than the disloyal revolt in the mind of in the minds of the media and the general public eye, uh,
And the state.
and the state. There is, I think, a point at which, if, for example, the farmers end up in a serious punch up with the cops, that's the sort of thing where the state finds it much more difficult directly afterwards to then justify itself and the violence it metes out. You have it on a less potent level, simply because of sexism and anti-leftism and all the rest of it. You see this with the protests over the killing of Sarah Everard, and the repression which took place there. There was definitely directly afterwards, there was a certain amount of, these are, and again, playing into sexist tropes, these are defenseless women who are being repressed by these big burly macho guys. Is this really how the state wants to comport itself? Is this liberal democracy? Um, and I think that in the same way, when you see people who are known to be very loyal and core part of the state's self-analysis, self-vision, um, are being attacked by the cops, then you get a dislocation in terms of how people perceive the legitimacy of that kind of repression.
That's right. I mean, but in a way that only comes into play if people even know about it. And I think it's quite clear that only outlets like Freedom have been reporting even about the kind of preemptive arrests of climate protesters and Palestine protesters. This stuff usually just doesn't make it to the mainstream headlines, whereas these events would.
Helps having a giant tractor as well. Great visual.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, I think what would certainly be of concern to existing concentrations of power is where farmers and environmentalists can actually find common ground, can actually find ways to talk to each other, and to ask bigger questions about how we even run this entire system, and how what kind of uh, property or cooperative arrangements would do better in order to feed the people in a time of climate breakdown. Um, and hopefully there will be some capacity in the UK left, in the UK radical movement, environmental movement, to build actual bridges if possible, and to at least try to interact with the more progressive, the more environmentally minded, the more communally minded sectors of the farmers movement, which are probably not the mainstream organizations, in order to create a different discourse. And I think we saw some beginnings of that already in the 90s with resistance to GM crops. And it might be a time for that to renew itself. All right. Well, let's move on to our next topic if we're ready, and that'll be, yeah, the widespread weeping and wailing with the election of Donald Trump. And for a lot of time in the head up to the election, I was saying, even if you don't think a Trump presidency will make much of a difference for the worse for Palestinians or for the Ukrainians, there's no doubt that it's going to make a lot of difference for the worse for the most vulnerable Americans. Nevertheless, I also think that there is a chance that the Trump presidency will mean worse things, or worse than they could be, for Palestinians, for Ukrainians, and for other people involved in conflicts around the world that the US and NATO has a hand in. But it's really a toss up, isn't it? The way that Blade Runner put it in our op ed yesterday, so much is determined by Trump's own desire for prestige, his desire for a win, his desire to look good, that it's not as simple as saying he's going to do whatever Putin or whatever Netanyahu want. Um, Things can go in all kinds of directions, and I think a lot of what will make the difference is how other actors, other NATO actors, other global power actors, will sort of differentiate themselves or not from the United States on these international topics. I mean, one thing that you want to wonder is whether, I mean, I think at this point, for example, a British arms embargo on Israel seems quite unlikely, but a French one or a Belgian one may be more in the cards. And, if Trump makes signs that he's basically prepared to let the Israeli government, the Israeli state, get away with the continuing genocide and ethnic cleansing in the Gaza Strip, then perhaps that might motivate countries like France to increase the volume on the criticism of Israel, if only in order to kind of score points domestically with their own publics. That's the most optimistic kind of scenario in that respect that some of us can think
I,
of.
I
With
think it's going to
Ukraine,
be.
who knows?
I think it's going to be a really part of the problem. I mean, sort of sort of going back a little to when you were talking about kind of Trump's need for shows of support and love is that there's going to be such a mix of people trying to divert his attention to their cause or um, to their interests by sheer flattery, um, and this kind of weird courtier system that seems to very rapidly being establish itself now. You can see it with Zelensky and Putin both kind of going in with, well, we don't need to talk to the US establishment anymore. We need to talk to Trump, specifically Trump. And he will then pass down his general view based on whoever's been nicest to him, whoever's kind of butted his ego up the most. And you can see this with people here that he's putting in the various positions, right? Is that they're all weird people, but they have one thing in common, which is they are completely beholden to Trump.
Absolutely. I
Whatever
mean, in
decision he makes, they're completely beholden to it.
I've long argued that Israel is a laboratory for trends that become, widespread later. And I think the way in which, Netanyahu has very consistently populated his cabinet with and key positions with people who have no special interest in the public good and are not particularly talented at what they do, but are excellent in their loyalty, personal loyalty to him, is now very much going to be a characteristic, of the American administration this way. And if and that is very worrying, because Netanyahu's government has also shown in the last year how it might be possible for a budding authoritarian regime who spends its time eroding whatever kind of outward democratic checks and balances exist in a settler colonial society, to get away with not just responsibility for its own citizens, harm, yeah, or the other way around, to get away not only with crimes against humanity, against perceived and constructed and real opponents and enemies, but also with absolute failures to defend their own citizens, and with eroding sort of what is supposed to be the basis of these citizens' loyalty to the regime, which comes from its claims to be able to defend them. And so I'm very concerned that, again, we will see some kind of 9/11 like event that, and that may not have to do necessarily with the Middle East. It may have to do with some other kind of constructed or amplified enemy. And we would see kind of similar processes writ large in the United States domestically, where, with kind of a global, with what's going on in Israel and Gaza, kind of somehow repeated on a global level. And that might even have to do with Mexico and with some kind of mass deportation operations,
I
right? So,
mean,
we
that
may
that
we may
whole
see a
thing.
situation on the border that is going to be, I mean, that might make what's, I mean, I don't think it will make what's going on in Gaza look like child's play, but will definitely be a kind of maybe a bigger but more diluted version of that. Who knows?
I mean, if you're trying to, shovel charitably 1 million people across one border all at once, it's going to be chaos. There's going to be people who do not want to go in large numbers, and the chances that it won't devolve into some kind of combat is quite low. I think if any of the things that he's saying he's going to do are actually attempted, and there's no guarantee of that. He promises all kinds of things without them actually taking place. But there's a groundswell of interest in that happening, and it was quite a big promise that was made. This kind of mass deportation process. But if it happens, yeah, absolutely, that turns into a snap crisis almost immediately. Um, of course, one of the interesting side notes there is it Trump who will be the person who ends up being alive dealing with that? Because Trump's not in great shape. He's quite elderly as it is. Is it going to be Vance? Peter
Well, I mean,
Thiel's
it's per
protege who's
who
running this.
I mean, whoever ends to, and I mean, whether it's Trump or not, I mean, I think we should expect it to be people like Stephen Miller, for example, running that kind of operation. I mean, Trump is quite likely to hand over this kind of operation to some of the worst right wingers around, in combination with uh, National Guard, military, or even militias that will be conscripted as a sort of new special force that is set up in order to deal with that. And we've already seen again that done, in various authoritarian regimes. It's not always necessary to get existing armed state forces on your side if you can start new ones and populate them
Yeah.
with your kind of people. And that would
Well,
be especially of concern because it's those kind of people who most often, yeah, the irregulars, who most often commit atrocities.
yeah, I mean, Texas very definitely has all the makings of a large paramilitary unit, just in the number of people who kind of go off on their own to, police the border, regardless of whether they have any official sanction. It doesn't take a huge leap to get from where they are now to here's a badge, do this on behalf of the US government.
Now, in terms of what resistance forces are rising up, I think, I mean, there is certainly an understanding among the more radical elements of the American left that we are facing open fascism, but it's very hard to know to what degree ordinary Americans, even in the more progressive parts of the country, are going to be able to, you know, risk anything in order to resist the makings of authoritarianism in the United States. But at this point, I think the United States is heading towards an authoritarian society, one in which there may be still formal elections held every 4 years, but where things are so far gerrymandered and institutions are so gutted of any sort of pretense of public service and filled with loyalists that it won't really matter. Well, on that optimistic note, I think we should move to at least one item that might give us a bit more hope, and that is the Global Meeting for Climate and Life, which concluded last week in Oaxaca, Mexico. This was sort of an anti-conference of parties, as the Conference of Parties of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change takes place in uh, oil and gas promoter Azerbaijan, where the number of fossil fuel company lobbyists well outnumber the representatives from those countries who are most likely to suffer the consequences of climate change. We're talking about the AntiCOP 2024, which brought together more than 250 delegates from various indigenous peoples in mainly Latin America, Abya Yala, as well as Palestine and Kurdistan, to denounce sort of the greenwashing of the climate change summits and put forward different kinds of practices. And there have been, some very sensible proposals coming out of that as alternative lines of action, whether that's the implementation of community-based water management, promotion of intercultural environmental education, the implementation of, autonomous funds for climate disasters, and of course recovering pre-colonial lands and practices to promote initiatives to revitalize spaces, to revitalize species, to revitalize ancestral agricultural systems. This was, I think, a very impressive meeting, an articulation from below that shows that there are real solutions, that there are grassroots based, bottom up ways of both mitigating the climate disaster in terms of real immediate reduction in fossil fuel use and carbon emissions also from land use changes. And here we're talking especially about replacing the massive beef industry with eco agriculture and much more kind of production of nutrition per square meter and much less carbon emissions per square meter, and the creation of human productive systems that can mimic ecosystems in their diversity, in their resilience, um, as well as the sort of political point of taking power away from big agribusinesses, from big kind of agricultural interests, who often in the developing countries are doing what they do backed with extreme violence, and putting it back in the hands of the people who actually live on the land and have the biggest stake in the land staying fertile, staying productive for future generations. That's a point that I guess connects in a way to what we started with about the farmers' protests.
I was going to say maybe there's a few lessons could be taken. I mean, that's not to say that there isn't actually a groundswell. Like, as with so many of these things, there's a lot of small farmers who do engage with these kinds of concepts. Like I suppose most famously, you have the organic production movement, all this kind of stuff, permaculture. Um, You've got also agricultural cooperativism remains very strong in Britain, um, and has to a lot of the time because when you're up against mass industry versions of agricultural business, you need to have access to kit that individual farmers can't afford a lot of the time, for example. Um, but yeah, like it's that kind of more holistic approach to uh, existing on the land around you, I suppose, is something which, obviously, in Indigenous America has a far more uh, integrated version of that going on now than you can find in somewhere like Britain or indeed in Europe as a whole. I mean, there's a lot of. I think there's a mild frustration that there isn't more interlinking goes on between our small scale agricultural producers and theirs. I think there's a huge hangover in Britain where the kind of poorer descendants of richer landowners um, are still, and obviously famously everywhere they are votes Tory. Even in the last election, they voted Tory. Um, but there's not actually any more, in a lot of cases, the same material conditions which originally provoked that loyalty to the Tories, right? There's a certain, in the same way as you can kind of talk about red wall Labour constituencies where they no longer have the connection to Labour, that kind of direct connection that they used to. Small scale farming doesn't gain a lot. It doesn't gain a lot from Labour because Labour is a kind of a centrist neoliberal phenomenon, but it doesn't gain much from the Tories either, because they are the same thing, just with a more aggressive form of social rightism. They have more in common, increasingly, with um, the kinds of processes that Indigenous people talk about. They're not super wealthy in the way that they used to be. Um, Whether that continued decline, makes for kind of cracks um, in the models that we can kind of shove more radical thinking through. Like it's not that long since we had strong socialist movements in the countryside. Um,
I think we can also look not that far back even, but to again what was going on 20, even 15 years ago, to say nothing about 30 and 40, where you had movements like This Land Is Ours. We had like I mentioned before, the anti-GM movements. The earlier kind of forms of which during the kind of turn of the millennium also were here and there building links through environmental radicals, through the anarchist movement, with groups in the global south that were beginning to pioneer these concepts. And I think that, certainly on the anarchist and direct action environmental end of things in this country, there is a lot of awareness of, the importance of making those links. But it remains to be seen whether people will actually pick up that glove, go out of their comfort zones, and be able to find ways to get those types of exchanges going more strongly again. But in a way, that does show us that, however dire the situation seems to be, and even in moments like these when, really, I can't remember a time in my own life where I felt such lack of optimism, to put it mildly, around political prospects. I think even, um, let's say 25 years ago, around 9/11 and the war on terror and everything, it still felt like there was more opening. Even in these times, there are still these creative, unexpected ways in which new connections and new ways of thinking can, like you said, open cracks in the way things are going. We're going to be publishing on Friday a piece celebrating 90 years to the birth of Nicholas Walter, who was also a prominent contributor to Freedom and a historian of radicalism and social movements. And one thing that he used to say was that, looking at the past, we see that there were forks in the road, that things didn't have to go the way they did. And that should inspire us for the present to still have that sense of openness rather than inevitability. Just try to look for those extra branches that we might be able to widen. So I promised an optimistic note, and I
That
and I
was a nice
delivered.
concluding line. Yeah, I liked it.
Okay. Well, thank you very much to all our viewers for joining us tonight. Please do surf to freedomnews.org.uk for the latest news from the UK and around the world. We are also freedompress.bluesky.social. We're on Facebook, we're on Telegram, soon Freedom on the Moon. Thank you very much, everybody.